Welcome back to The Bottom Line. I am joined today by Tommy Marquez. Tommy, how's it going?
It's going all right. California is on fire. There's smoke in the sky and ash raining down on my car as we speak. So, I'm really, really proud about the investment I made in the Doomsday Bunker at the
Oh,
start of this
good.
year.
Good.
2020 is making me look like a smart man.
Definitely. Well, going a little bit better than your current residence in California is the conversation that CrossFit HQ had with the rest of the world via town hall this week, which in and of itself is a big change as far as communication and transparency goes from the old HQ that we had sort of gotten used to, don't you think?
100%.
Yeah.
Within the first month of the new ownership, we have a very forward-facing public forum, speaking directly to the community and allowing the community to interact through questions from the person at the very tip top. And I'm trying to think if that ever happened once in like the 8.5 years that I worked there, or the 10 years that I've been involved, at least to that degree. And, on top of that, throughout the meeting, they provided emails and names of new hires, and they were very transparent with a lot of things that was going on. So I think just that level of communication alone is a really good foot to get started off on.
For sure, for sure. Yeah, I can't think of any other moment or event where I was like, oh, I really got everything I needed out of that information wise. So, no, definitely, definitely cool. And they covered so many different aspects of the sport of CrossFit and the CrossFit community and, sort of the direction of HQ moving forward. But what I want to focus on just to start is the notion that new CEO Eric Roza seems to be very invested in helping the professional CrossFit athlete make a real career out of the sport of fitness. I mean, he said straight up, he doesn't believe that there are enough athletes right now who can make a living in CrossFit and that that's a problem.
I was going to say, well, he used a great anecdote with Scott Panchik. You look at someone who is, you know, been in the top 10 and even the top 5 as much as that just about anyone who hasn't been on the podium. And he's kind of the poster child for someone I think that by all means is a superstar in the sport, is one of the fittest men to have competed in the sport across his career. And there's no reason why he shouldn't be able to make a living on his own, separate from anything else. And I think that was a key distinction, is that that a lot of these athletes, they're able to make a living, but there's this supplemental type income that has to
Right.
come from within the space, from things like being a gym owner, being a coach, starting your own brand, doing things outside of the elements that flow naturally with the circles of being a professional athlete. And that's kind of been the elephant in the room for quite some time, that the earning potential is very concentrated at the top. And there's a lot of athletes that put in a tremendous amount of time and work that just don't see the return on investment that you would see in other sports. And actually, it's funny you mentioned, I had a great conversation about with Brooks Like, who's a kind of well-known kind of person in the community. Is a
Right.
former NHL player, played in the NHL for more than a dozen years. And he was telling me that the lowest paid guy in the NHL, someone who for the most part may not even suit up for games and sits in the rafters for half the season, is going to make $500,000,
Oh, no
you know,
way.
just from salary. And that's
Huh.
that's that's from, things from having a players union and, collective
Yep.
bargaining agreements, and having again, the legislative pieces in place to make sure that athletes are well represented, their interests are represented, and they also get fair pay. And you're talking about the lowest guy in the NHL getting a standard paycheck just for being on a roster, higher than what, the fittest man and woman get combined pretty much at the games
Right.
for winning.
Right. I mean, you're looking at athletes in the sport of CrossFit that not only do they need two or three different types of revenue streams just to make like a living, but they're also scraping by with sponsorship deals that sometimes don't even cover. Sometimes they're just product deals. Sometimes they're like swapsies. Sometimes they don't even cover their entry fee to
Mhm.
all the myriad of different sanctional events that we're seeing these days. So it's definitely tough, especially for some of the younger athletes coming up who haven't had a lot of experience in the business side of things to make a living, make sustainable living, not $500,000, just livable wages.
Yeah, totally. And we're still getting to the point where even with those new age athletes coming up, having athletes in front of them that can kind of show them the way, as far
Mhm.
as like, this is what I did, this is what was successful, because those athletes are still figuring out the path as well. And there's a handful of athletes that are obviously the exception, but
Right.
there's only so many Rich Froning, Matt Fraser, Tia Claire Toomey, Katrin David's daughters of the world, the Annie Thor's daughters of the world, that are able to get these big market deals relative to CrossFit, and ultimately have carved out a path for them because I mean, let's face it, not everyone has the resources at hand.
Mhm.
Most of those athletes have agents. Most of those athletes have been at the sport for an extended period of time, have certain aspects that are much more marketable, and they have, big brands behind them from the get-go. So
Right.
it's a little bit of a tough sledding out there. And I think there's a natural progression that comes, even if you look back as far as 2011, when Reebok first entered the fray. You
Yeah,
had a
yeah.
ton of athletes that were getting sponsored for the first time that had no idea what that world was like. They didn't have agents, they weren't represented. And for the most part, those brands that decided to invest in those athletes got pretty sweet deals for the
Mhm.
return that they were getting from a dedicated fan base like CrossFit. And now we're starting to see that next evolution happen. Okay, all right, a few of these athletes are starting to learn their worth a little bit. But what really needs to happen, I think, for the betterment of everyone involved, is now HQ can step in and really be a force multiplier in this. And I think there was a quote that Eric mentioned. He said, in the past, HQ stood by and let people be successful. And I think we can be much more proactive in helping people be successful. And I think with having the parent organization be a part of that,
Mhm.
like you see in other avenues, with the NHL, the NFL, the NBA, I think that stands to not only support the athletes, but also support the sport as well, because
Yeah.
the organization is going to benefit from having, internationally known superstars in a sport that people can look up to.
Absolutely. That's the rising tide for
Mhm.
sure. What I thought was really interesting was one of the things that he mentioned as far as figuring out how to help these athletes really make a career out of this was bringing more money into the sport by getting more viewers, more participation, more eyeballs. I mean, he sort of likened it to the sport of tennis, which has a billion viewers and wants to get CrossFit to that point within the next decade, within the next 10 years. I mean, that sort of to me is a very different type of a step, an argument that we've heard from HQ in the past, especially given the fact that we've lost so much in media, yourself
Mhm.
included, over the last
Yeah.
couple of years.
It's interesting because if you go back 2 years ago, um, yeah, 2 years ago, still, when when we were both still working for HQ, and those types of conversations to a lesser degree were still happening, right? There was at least internally on the games team and internally on the games media team of this vision to drive viewership, to bring money into the sport and do those types of things. But it wasn't something that necessarily resonated through the rest of the company and from the top down, particularly from the owner and leader and the decision maker in the company. And it's refreshing to hear that now. It's unfortunate that that comes at this time when it's like so much of the village has been burned behind you in many regards. And I obviously think that it can be rebuilt, but it's going to take some time. And I think Eric has some connections and ability to operate in a stratosphere that can remedy that fairly quickly. But it's, you think about the comparisons. He mentioned that tennis has roughly a billion in live viewership throughout the season. And then you look at the platforms that CrossFit was kind of uniquely poised to take advantage of. So when the games are coming up, particularly at its peak in 2017, 2018, in terms of viewership, the live streaming kind of business was still relatively new. It's pretty commonplace now for most people not going through cable subscriptions. So companies like Facebook were really willing to invest in sports like CrossFit that have such a dedicated viewership, that they could rely on, both from an advertising standpoint, all these other things, and that really brings more money into the business, because now they see not only the company and the sport as reliable, but the athletes as well, because those athletes are tapping into that same viewership. And it certainly helps to be on the largest cable network in the world, and CBS too. And so hopefully being able to renegotiate those deals and kind of build that trust back to bring those in will, it's impossible for it not to bring more money into the sport, just because you're talking about primetime television. Whether you like it or not, some of the most eyeballs on the sport were in that hour in CBS, when you have millions of live viewers watching just casually, on top of the the ad time that you get for commercials that CrossFit wouldn't otherwise be able to afford, and a handful of the other things that kind of spin off of that. So I really hope that they're able to work cohesively with those brands that are interested in promoting the media, as well
Mm.
as the media makers too, because I mean, let's face it, they talked about bringing live viewership, but as far as I know, there's only a handful of people that work for CrossFit Media
Right.
right now that um, and none of which are even remotely, in the realm of live broadcast. So that's a big question mark for them going forward.
Yeah, I'll be very curious to see. It didn't necessarily sound like he was talking about rebuilding some sort of giant internal media team, but it does sound like he has a really good understanding or handle on who in our space is doing what and what kind of resources he could pull in order to make whatever type of additional content or broadcast or whatever happen in the future. Like, we're all out there. I don't necessarily know if it's going to be harkening back to the old system and the old hierarchy within CrossFit HQ itself, but it just does sound like they're going to be willing to lean into the content makers a lot more to make things branded from HQ itself, which will be new in the last 2 years.
Yeah, well, one of the nice things too is it's been nice to see the response from a lot of people basically saying like, "Hey, we would love to have some of the media team back," because clearly, and then this is ultimately speaks to what our goal was: we want the media that we make to resonate with people and inspire people and have an impact on them, on a daily basis. And it sounds like it had, at least I hope, based on the feedback during the live stream and the stuff that we've gotten afterwards. But the one I was hoping, and I think this will get more details as we go along. When the last question was asked about specifically the future of the CrossFit media department, Eric said something to the effect of CrossFit media at its best has been when we had some full-time employees, some contractors, and additional media professional and amateur that are creating media. Really focusing on more great storytelling for CrossFit, getting the great stories out there is going to be a key part of what CrossFit does. And that means a lot, obviously, given some of the things that he said earlier when he talked about some of the personal investments and the money he was willing to commit for things like diversity and equality and inclusion, getting upstart stuff through the CrossFit Foundation. So that tells me that anything that he sees as important, he's willing to invest in, which is it's going to require at this stage because of some of the bridges that were burned before. But at the same time, it leaves me wondering, when he references that time when CrossFit media was at its best, I'm curious what time he's referencing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I thought the same thing.
So I'm
because
like,
we didn't have all those freelancers and additional content creators until 2019, really.
Yeah. And there was some, but the megaphone really wasn't handed over to them yet. And it was like more of a what we do in the shadows type thing. And I'm genuinely curious to see if where he sees the kind of nice mixture is the blend of all that, because I do think that there's going to be a need for broadcast media and regular content. And if I'm being honest, like looking back at now, like what we had, and I'll speak for our internal games and media team for the studio, what we had built for that team, CrossFit was getting at an absolute steal. And I'll say this straight up. And
Nice.
I happily worked under those circumstances, and I absolutely loved it. But I mean, they got away with a for what we were doing, a top-notch studio, a team that was willing to pour their hearts in, and they got us at a discount. And so I think for them to want to be able to capitalize on that live viewership, they're gonna have to have a more consistent presence in that regard.
Sure. Well, I'm so incredibly curious to see how it happens. I selfishly hope that we can all get back out onto the competition floor sooner rather than later to make awesome live broadcasts and content and all of the above. But at least, we know that he's got his head in the right place. And at least we know that he understands the intersection of media and eyeballs and what that means for the greater sport and what that means for the athletes, and a trickle-down effect when it comes to salaries and moving ahead in the sport of fitness, really making sure that this is a real, legitimate opportunity for people to make a living, so that we as fans can capitalize on all the amazing work that they can do, really, at the end of the day. So curious to see how it all shakes out. But Tommy, thank you so much for your time and your expertise on this matter. And we will see you guys next time on Bottom Line.